Okay, my topic is on distance learning and its impact on student motivation to learn. Well, before we had this pandemic, no one really questioned the effects of distance learning because we had never been put in this position before. So the purpose of this study was to study the impact of virtual schooling on student motivation to learn. I asked the questions, what, if any, any effect does distance learning have on student motivation? And if it does have an effect, what common factors or themes were driving this increase or this decrease in student motivation? Okay, so my related literature, this isn't all of it, but here's some notable conclusions that I read. I organized my literature beginning 20 years ago and moving forward to the state of distance learning today. So I'm looking at a timeline to see how attitudes and motivation in distance learning have changed over the last 20 years. So I'll read a couple of them. In early studies, they found that it was not about how content is delivered, but rather students' own self-determination that determines their learning. Using a variety of digital media does not necessarily increase student satisfaction and motivation. Coming up on 2020, obviously, the more advanced we get, the more we're able to integrate digital media into distance learning. And then the last and most recent finding that I read was that the instructor's presence and interaction plays a big part in student motivation and engagement, although I did not see any evidence of that in my own study. Participants, 10th, 11th, and 12th graders of English. I had 50 to 70 students because not all students participated in both of the data collection exercises that I gave them, so it varied. Just about even for male and female, 2 English learners, highly Hispanic population. Almost half of the participants were honors students. Mixed methods I used for this design. I used qualitative data collection in an exploratory fashion, and that was collected in the form of written responses to the prompt. Quantitative analysis was done through a survey on Google Classroom, and here I looked at gathered statistic information about my participants and their motivation levels. Okay, so first I did qualitative data collection and asked the students to respond to these 2 questions in a 300-word narrative response in their journals. Are you motivated to learn in a distance learning situation? If you are, what factors have helped you stay motivated? If not, what factors have contributed to your lack of motivation? So this was a lot of narrative to comb through here. Students were asked to then complete the following survey for quantitative information. And here's a link to this survey, but I'm not going to click that right now because I don't want to mess up the recording. But this will take you to the full survey. So they were asked, how has based on the results of the qualitative data gathering, I formulated these 3 questions. How has your motivation to learn been affected by distance learning? And students chose one of these, although almost all of the students chose decreased or increased, but I'll get to that later. And then the other 2 questions are on the survey. All right. I found from the qualitative data that there are 4 most frequent factors that contributed to increased student motivation: support from parents or family, self-motivation or responsibility for their own learning, a desire to get good grades or desire for a future career or success. For students who had decreased motivation to learn, I found that 3 most common reasons: isolation or lack of socialization, emotional or mental issues, and distractions in the home. So here's the results of my Google survey from Google Forms survey for my quantitative data. This is really, really amazing that the exact same amount of students said that they had increased motivation as the same percentage of students as the percentage of students who said they had decreased or low motivation. Almost 12% said they had no motivation at all, these are other reasons that weren't on the prompt, or these are other options that were less common. And here's some examples of them over here in the corner. So I've had a place on there that said other. So there were other reasons, but these two were the most common. Okay, for students whose level has decreased, you got a fairly even split here between the three most common factors: too many distractions, mental issues, feelings of isolation. So these are fairly equal, although it's a little heavy on mental and emotional issues. Hardly anybody put another reason. So a little skewed here, but they're almost equally or fairly equally distributed. If your motivation level has increased, which of the following is the choice is why. So these students, they did not apply, but of the students whose level has increased, you have a really even spread here of things. But there's a problem, because where I had many students replied that parental and family support was the major reason they stayed motivated, when they actually took the survey and had a choice of reasons to choose, of factors, hardly anybody chose parental or family support, which is really, really bizarre. So there's a discrepancy here. And I think the reason for that is that once they had other choices in front of them, they gravitated towards the choices, other choices that were given them. I categorized the student responses into ultimately only two categories, because no one responded that they hadn't had a change in motivation at all. So I categorized into increased motivation to high or increased motivation, or to low or no motivation. So then I subcategorized those two categories into the common factors attributed to the loss or gain of motivation that I just mentioned. Once I got those categorized, I looked at them further, the reasons, these factors that attributed to their lack of or gain of motivation, and I looked at what types of concepts they were. For example, were they concrete or abstract factors? Are they tangible or intangible factors? Are they intrinsic or extrinsic factors? And that's how I began to break them down. Quantitative analysis provided an overall statistical look at trends in the most common factors determined in the quantitative data. Limitations: possibility of bias. These are my students. I know them, and teachers often can't help but being biased, for if nothing else, just based on individual student needs. Narrative responses could have been interpretive. There could be other factors influencing student motivation, such as their health, their physical health, other things. Issues with technology, including equipment and internet access, for sure. So this is the conclusion I came to based on just a quick snippet of it. Most of the major factors that are impacting student motivation to learn are abstract in nature and relate to qualities or mental states of being. The qualities support pride, self-determination, and desire to accomplish most often contributed to increased levels of student motivation. Feelings of isolation, lack of socialization, and mental and emotional strain often contributed to decreased motivation to learn. Only two common factors were concrete, tangible contributors: grades and distractions in the home, things that could easily be controlled, or, well, theoretically. It appears that student motivation is rooted in the individual mentalities of the students themselves. So their motivation to learn online is a highly individualized and abstract concept. And that's it. This is a link to the Works Cited page. And here you have your references.